Well, hi everyone. Here we are again for virtual story time. And I'm so glad, even though I can't see you, I know you're out there and it's nice to connect with you and spend some time with you. So today we are going to read another chapter of the book that we've been reading. It's called Mary Jones and Her Bible. And we're going to read chapter 5. That means we're about halfway through. After today, we're more than halfway through. There are 8 chapters in this book. And so we'll keep meeting every day here on Facebook until we're finished the book. So then after that, I'm not sure yet. Maybe we'll go back to meeting once a week. But let's keep meeting every day until we finish our book. Well, how are you doing while you're spending time at home, while you're spending time more indoors and not getting to do the things you normally do or getting to see the people that you normally see? Have you had more time to think of things? And maybe have you thought of some good inventions? Things that you would invent to make staying at home or times like this easier? You know, as I've been thinking about it the last few days, I've thought about all the things that make working from home and being away from my family, things that my extended family, things that have made this time easier, and all the inventions that have come about since I was a kid. And I thought, you know, I'm guessing that some new inventions are going to come out of this time too. Things that people think would make this situation easier for us. So as I think about what exists today that didn't exist when I was a kid, that has made me having to stay at home a lot easier, there are a lot of things. So, and I'm not that old. I'm a little bit old, but I'm not that old. So in my short lifetime, there are a lot of things that are new and have been invented recently, like video conferencing. That's pretty recent. We weren't able to video conference that many years ago. Oh, and watches like this smartwatch. Hi. Watches like this smartwatch that is basically a computer on my wrist. That definitely didn't exist when I was a kid. I would have thought it was so cool to have a smartwatch. Well, cell phones weren't around when I was a kid. Maybe they were available to some people in very experimental phases, but they weren't available to just anyone. And you know what else wasn't around and available to everyone when I was a kid, even when I was in college? The internet. Can you imagine going all the way through 4 years of college without the internet? Yeah, that's how we did it. And we had to go to the library and stand at, you moms and dads and grandparents listening, you remember this. You'd have to stand at the card catalog and look through and find the little card that had the information for the book that you needed. Then you'd have to write it down and go upstairs into the library stacks and find the book you needed if it was there and someone else hadn't checked it out. And then if it was there, you could take it home and do your research. But now we have the internet. It makes things like working from home and having to stay at home so much easier. You know what else I didn't have when I was a kid? I didn't have a laptop computer, and we didn't have social media. So just think, even though it's difficult right now, a lot of things have been invented in recent years that have made this time where we have to stay at home a lot easier. What do you think could be invented in the near future that would make working remotely or being isolated even better? Well, I've had a few thoughts of what I think might come out of this time. I think that we're going to maybe see new homes when they're built, that architects and designers are going to include not only bedrooms and kitchens and bathrooms, but maybe they're going to include live streaming rooms. What do you think? A little room on the side of the house that has windows up high for nice lighting and just a small little space where you can live stream? I think that's a good idea. I think they're going to invent that. And, in grocery stores, have you seen the pictures where, or maybe you've seen in real life, where people are putting tape on the floor to show you how far to stand from the customer in front of or behind you? I think that companies are going to start making fancy stickers that you can put on the floor. And now when we go to the grocery store in the future, we're going to see stickers where we're supposed to stand and where we're supposed to walk. That might be kind of fun to see the little sticker map leading us throughout the store. Well, what else? I think people who are very technical are going to start inventing better lighting systems that we at home can use to set up lights for when we want to do video conferencing or making videos like this. Oh, they'll probably make pop-up backdrops. So instead of you looking at Cassiopeia and my closet and my bookshelf, I could put something behind me that would make it look like I'm somewhere really fancy. There are some virtual backdrops you can do already, but I think those pop-up backdrops, I think people are going to invent those. And what about virtual classrooms? I know that those already exist. You can do online school. Both my daughters have done online school in the years past, and they sort of have virtual classrooms, but I think we're going to see all of that kind of be developed even further in the future. So maybe while you're at home, you can have your thinking cap on what you think should be invented, and who knows, maybe you'll have the next great idea to help us through the next situation where we all have to stay at home. Well, those are my thoughts, and I want to share with you the next chapter in Mary Jones and her Bible. Should we get reading? Let's see where we are. Oh, and again, my Jake bookmark. Wonder how Jake would do with social isolating and being at home. I don't think he'd do very well at all, but he'd probably not be afraid to use technology as much as he could. All right, Mary Jones and her Bible. We are on chapter 5. And again, if for some reason you're just stumbling across this video for the first time in this series, feel free to look back on our Facebook page and you'll see that all of our story videos from the previous chapters of this book are right there. So you can always go back and start at the beginning and catch up. Well, chapter 5. "It is a good thing it's winter time, with not much to do in the garden," said Mary one evening, a few days after she had brought home her first piece of needlework, "and too cold for the children to be taken outside. I'm going to have some really cozy evenings." She glanced brightly around the room as she sat on her stool by the fire with a curtain over her knees. Remember that just in our last chapter that we read yesterday, Mary was praying that she would get some work so that she could earn some more money to save to buy her very own Bible, a Bible of her own. And now she got some needlework, and the Mrs. Evans at the farm next door gave her some chickens, and so now she's working on that needlework, which is hemming some curtains. Now her dad speaking. "You put your lazy old father to shame, Mary," said Jacob. "Here am I." Oh, a long fit of coughing interrupted what he was about to say. "Oh, Father, you lazy?" cried Mary. "Why, you work from morning till night when you are well. Oh, that dreadful cough." Jacob Jones was sitting in his chair by the fire, for he had an attack of asthma that was worse than usual, and he looked wizened and old with the strain. The attack over, he sank back in his chair, almost exhausted. "I know what has made him worse," said Mrs. Jones. "He would go out and take up the last of the potatoes this afternoon, in spite of the damp weather." "I was going to do that tomorrow morning, before I went to school," protested Mary. "Oh, Father, why did you do it?" "Oh, yes, Mary," said Jacob teasingly. "You don't need any rest. You can work all day and all night, too." "This isn't work," answered Mary, sewing away for dear life. "For every length of hemming I do means another penny for the box." The next Saturday, Mary went as usual to the farm. "You look very bright today, Mary," said Mrs. Evans. "Has anything especially good happened?" Mary told her of her new work, and Mrs. Evans was very interested. "I need some help with my sewing," she said. "The boys wear out everything. When you have finished Mrs. Ellis's work, I will give you some mending to do if you like." "Of course I will," cried Mary. And when she reached home, she met her mother in triumph. "I have another order," she said, "from Mrs. Evans." And so the year wore on. Mary still gathered sticks for old Mrs. Reese and still took the children out on the hillside in the summer days. That was a pleasure always, for the children were a year older and could understand and respond to her teaching even better, and the group of little ones became like a class. "They will soon be going to Sunday school," Mary said, "and they will be able to understand their lessons." Another year had gone, and Mary and her father and her mother sat at the table again to count out the contents of the blue money box. Mary first put aside the shilling from last year, and then, as before, she placed the money in little piles. "There's more silver this year, lass," said Jacob. "Yes, the hens laid well," answered Mary, "and there was the needlework." She counted around the heaps of coins and placed the shillings with them. 2 shillings and 7 pence, she said. "Oh, how lovely! More than 2 and 6 pence. I shall get my Bible soon. I shall get my Bible very soon." She clasped her hands in delight. "Thanks be to God," cried Mrs. Jones, "and bravo, Mary dear. You have worked wonderfully. I felt sure that you had done better this year than last. But we will not work any more tonight. Put your precious money away, for I have prepared a special supper tonight, just for the occasion." "I thought I smelled something good, Molly," said Jacob, as Mrs. Jones began to put out a savory stew. That was a joyful supper, for there was a feeling of thankfulness amongst the 3 who partook of it that made it almost a sacred feast. Hi, Miss Danielle. They sang the doxology and then sang a special grace, for Mary said she felt as if she could not stop singing. Her heart was so glad and so full of hope. That winter was cold and wet. Many a time Mary came home from school soaked with rain, her hair tossed with the rough winds. One afternoon, Mrs. Jones met Mary at the door when she arrived. "I'm sorry, dear," she said, "but do you think you could go down into the village for some medicine for your father? His cough has been very bad all day." "I thought he coughed a great deal before I left home this morning," said Mary in anxious tones. "Yes, Mother, I will run down at once." Mary was soon back again with the medicine, and much of the evening was taken up with attending to the poor sufferer. Jacob was no better in the morning. He had had a bad night and was really ill. Mary offered to stay from school and to help her mother, but Mrs. Jones would not agree. And hi, Michael and Rachel. "Go to school, dear," she said. "He may be better during the day." But the next day, and for many days after, Mary had to stay at home and nurse her father while her mother toiled at her weaving. "I must earn what I can," her mother said, "or we shall have no money for food." Instead of putting the money in her box, Mary brought what she got for her eggs to her mother, or she used the eggs for her father's nourishment. She was distressed at her father's state, for he had never been so ill before. Her mother, too, was worried and anxious. February came in clear and warm, and Jacob revived, but he was thin and he was weak for a long time. Still, he was better, and Mary and her mother were happy. Mary had done a little needlework at odd moments for Mrs. Evans and apologized for its long delay. Now the neglected garden must be dug and planted, and she had not a minute to spare for anything that might add to her money in the box. She worked most of the evening at her school books, for after her long absence from school, she was behind. "Oh, Mother," she said on the first day of her return to school, "I am right down at the bottom of my class, even below Ivor Thomas, and he is not very clever." "Never mind, dear," said her mother. "You will soon catch up again. Give up the needlework for a little while." "I really like the lessons best," Mary confessed, smiling. "They are so interesting." So the money box only increased a penny that year, but Mary, knowing the reason, was not disappointed. If Father keeps well, I will do better next year, she said. But Jacob was weakened by his sickness, and he left the little gardening jobs that he used to do to Mary. Mrs. Jones had to work longer hours at her loom to make up for Jacob's feebler efforts. The sum of money in the box mounted very slowly in those days. One day, when Mary was nearly 15, so quite a few years have gone by since the first chapter in our book, haven't they? In the very first chapter, she was 8, and so now she's almost 15. That's 7 years that have gone by. When Mary was nearly 15, she came back from school with some news. Mr. Ellis, that's her teacher, he's leaving, she said sadly. We shall miss him so much. He is taking charge of a school in Barmouth. Well, well, said Jacob Jones. Yes, you will miss him, I'm sure. What a lot you have learned under his teaching, Mary. If you look back over the last 4 years or so, and remember what you were when the school first opened, you must feel you are not the same Mary Jones. But I am the same Mary Jones, Mary answered quietly. I have learned from Mr. Ellis, but I have learned much more from the Bible. Every week I find more and more lovely teaching in it. I shall never be really happy until I can read my own Bible every day. Do you know who is taking Mr. Ellis's place? Asked Mr. Jones. Mr. Lewis Williams, said Mary, but I don't know anything about him. Only I think he is younger than Mr. Ellis. Well, not long after this, the new master of the school arrived, and he took up his duties. He was a short, serious man with a quiet manner. A few of the more unruly boys eyed him curiously and thought they might be able to have some fun with this quiet young man. But they soon found out their mistake. Mr. Ellis had been a good disciplinarian, but the new teacher proved himself more than equal to any plot that the boys might hatch. He had an iron discipline, but soon quelled any riotous behavior. The quiet, serious young man that stood at the master's desk had, during the past 6 years, overcome difficulties that would seem to most people to be impossible. Determination and faith in God had raised him from ignorance and sin to the position that he now held. Lewis Williams, the new teacher, was born in 1774 of very humble parents, and as was usual in those days, he grew up entirely untaught. He lived a wild, lawless life. When he was about 18, perhaps only looking for some amusement, he attended a prayer meeting one evening. Mr. Jones was reading and expounding the 5th chapter of the Epistle to the Romans. He spoke with a fire and a conviction that impressed even Lewis Williams, who sat in a corner of the mission room and listened. Oh, hi to Angel's son. Nice to have you join us today. The preacher first read the chapter through, and to Lewis Williams, unused to the words of Scripture, they fell on his ears with strange force. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. And again, that as sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign through righteousness unto eternal life by Jesus Christ our Lord. Sin and death, sin and death. These two dreadful thoughts gripped Lewis Williams's mind. He sat staring at the preacher. All thought of fun had gone, and he hung on every word spoken. The preacher changed his note of stern warning to one of hope and of peace. Lewis Williams felt as if something had struck at his heart. The worshipers sang a hymn, but he hardly heard, and when all was over, he stumbled out into the darkened street. He had gone into that mission meeting a hardened sinner, and he came out a Christian. His former friends made his life difficult in that town, and in a short time he took up some work on a farm. As he went about his work, he noticed that the boys of the place were wild and lawless. The memory of his own boyhood rose up in his mind. He wished that he could do something for these poor, neglected lads. They only need teaching, he thought, but who is to teach them? The answer came almost like an actual voice. You must do it yourself, Lewis Williams. But he could not read himself. How could he teach others? For days he thought and he planned. I will do it, he said at last to himself. I am a man, and I can more easily learn than these boys. He went to an old woman that he knew, Mrs. Betty Evans, who could read and write, and told her of his great desire to open a Sunday school and also a night school or an evening school for the boys of the town. That would be a grand work, Betty Evans said. What can I do to help you? She had expected Lewis to ask, perhaps, for some money towards any expenses for the project. I want you to help me to learn to read, was his astonishing answer. So Mrs. Betty gave Lewis Williams his first lesson in reading. On the day before the evening class, Lewis would, under Betty Evans's teaching, commit to memory so much of the alphabet, so many words as were necessary for the next lesson. The boys were entirely ignorant, but they came willingly to the class. Can you imagine that? The teacher, Mr. Williams, he had to learn the alphabet. He had to learn even just a few words so that he could read and he could understand, so that he could then teach the boys. And hi to Matthias. Hi, thanks for listening. And so he learned there from the woman, Mrs. Betty Evans, before he could then go and teach the students. Lewis Williams learned and taught and labored. He longed to become a preacher and would go out on Sundays to the churches in the district to listen to the sermons, still learning pronunciation of words and anything that would educate him for his master's service. It was about this time that the Reverend Thomas Charles of Bala met him on a tour of inspection of his schools. He stayed with the schoolmaster, Mr. John Jones. Mr. Charles asked Mr. Jones if he knew of anyone who could teach in a school that he wished to open in another town. There is a young man named Lewis Williams who holds evening classes for boys and a Sunday school too, answered Mr. Jones. I know nothing of him myself, but I have heard it said that he cannot read properly himself. Impossible, exclaimed Mr. Charles. How can he teach if he cannot read? Well, sir, I have wondered about that myself, said Mr. Jones. But he is well spoken of. He is a devout Christian. If you wish, I will send a message over and ask him to come and see you. Yes, do, answered Mr. Charles. I must see this young teacher. Lewis Williams came for the interview. Roughly dressed and very diffident in his manner, he looked anything but a successful schoolmaster. But Mr. Charles never allowed people to feel uneasy in his presence. I was anxious to meet you, Mr. Williams, he said, as I hear that you hold evening classes. Have you many boys? Yes, sir, a good number. Too many for one to teach, in fact. I hear that you have never had any schooling. Is that so? Inquired Mr. Charles. No, sir, I have never been to school. Did your parents teach you at home? No, sir, they could not read or write. How then do you manage to teach? Tell me how you do this most excellent work, for I am interested in schools and I am anxious to get more good teachers, said Mr. Charles. Lewis Williams hesitated. He was ashamed of his poor efforts at his night school, yet Mr. Charles was kind and sympathetic. Lewis told him of his laborious learning, his help from Betty Evans and the grammar school boys, and of the success, in spite of his difficulties, of his class. Mr. Charles was deeply touched. I see that with a little assistance, he said, you might be able to do much good work. In fact, you have already done good, useful work. I will speak to Mr. Jones, the master here, and advise him that with some teaching from him, you might be able to learn thoroughly, and in a year or so, I trust that I may be able to engage you. Sorry, my phone was ringing. I'm not sure if that came through on the video or not. Let me find my place back. One of my schools. But I would like to hear you read. You say you cannot read well. I am curious to know how well you can really read. Mr. Charles took out a small New Testament from his pocket and gave it to Williams, open to the epistle to the Hebrews. Williams slowly and stumblingly read a few verses from the first chapter. That will do, thank you, said Mr. Charles. I see you have overcome obstacles that would have baffled most men. Follow my advice. Study under Mr. Jones, and I have great hopes for you. Well, cheered by this half promise of future employment, Lewis Williams studied for 3 or 4 months under Mr. Jones, then continued by himself until he was fit to be engaged as a paid teacher in a small school. A year later, he came to be the teacher at Abergynowyn School, which of course was Mary Jones's school. Oh, wasn't that interesting to hear the story of how this new teacher at Mary's school became a teacher? And I think we're going to learn a little bit more in our next chapter, which is chapter 6, just of how her new teacher was able to inspire and continue to help Mary in not only to learn and to read herself, but in her ultimate quest, which is to have a Bible of her very own. Isn't it hard to even imagine what it would have been like to not have been able to learn to read or to learn the alphabet or to write words? And this young man, Lewis, he as an adult, he took it upon himself to learn those things so that he could teach others. It's amazing and wonderful. And as we were talking about before we started our story, we were talking about all the things that have been invented in recent years to help us with our situation right now of having to be at home. We have video conferencing, and we have laptops, and we even have computers right on our wrists and our watches, really. But back in the 1700s, even having the ability to read and to write was a great, great privilege. And so technology changes quickly, and things are available to us that could not even have been thought of 100 years ago. And so it just kind of puts our situation now into perspective for us, doesn't it? Makes us thankful for what we have today. Well, thanks for joining me again for another chapter of Mary Jones and her Bible, and we'll pick it up again here tomorrow, right here on FaceTime and Facebook, I should say, and I look forward to seeing you then. Take care and stay healthy and well. Bye.